Nancy thought breaking up with Daniel, her controlling and possessive boyfriend, would be the end of her nightmare. She changes her number, moves to a new apartment, and tries to rebuild her life. But Daniel refuses to let go. Nancy thought breaking up with Daniel, her controlling and possessive boyfriend, would be the end of her nightmare. She changed her number, moved to a new apartment across town, and started piecing her life back together. I was there for her through it all, her best friend since middle school, practically her sister. When she finally got the courage to leave him, I was relieved. We all were, but none of us, especially Nancy, could have predicted what happened next. It started off innocently enough. A missed call from a number she didn't recognize. She didn't think much of it. She gets a lot of spam calls anyway. Then came the text. "You can't hide from me." Nancy thought it was a prank at first. Maybe some jerk got her new number. But the messages didn't stop. They got weirder, more specific. Stuff only Daniel could know. She showed me the messages one night when we were out for dinner. Her hands were shaking as she passed me her phone. "What the hell, Nance? Have you called the cops?" "Yeah, but they said it's not a direct threat, so there's nothing they can do." Her voice was small, like she was trying not to let the fear take over. "Block the number," I told her, trying to stay calm for her sake. I did, but then the texts started coming from different numbers. It's like he's got endless phones. The worst part was the voicemails. He never said anything, just breathing. Deep, ragged, almost like he was right there with her, whispering down her neck. It sent shivers down my spine just thinking about it. Weeks went by, and it felt like we were living in a horror movie. Every time her phone buzzed, she'd jump. Every creak in her apartment made her paranoid. I offered to let her stay with me, but she was stubborn. "I'm not letting him scare me out of my own home," she said, her voice wavering. Then one night, she called me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you come over? I think he's here." I was at her place in 10 minutes flat. She was sitting on her couch, pale as a ghost, clutching a kitchen knife like her life depended on it. She handed me her phone without a word. On the screen was a photo of her from that very night, taken through her living room window. The caption read, "I'm closer than you think." We called the cops again, and this time, they took it seriously. They searched her apartment, the whole building, but found nothing. No sign of Daniel. No evidence he'd been there. They told her to stay with someone for the night, and she finally agreed to come back to my place. But she couldn't sleep. Neither could I. We just sat there in my living room, the TV on for background noise, but neither of us paying attention. Her phone kept buzzing, but she didn't even look at it. She couldn't. The next morning, we went back to her apartment. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but when she walked into the bathroom, she screamed. I rushed in to find her staring at the mirror. There, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "You can't escape me." We ran out of there so fast, we didn't even grab our things. We drove straight to the police station, shaking, terrified. They sent officers back to her apartment, but again, nothing. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. Nancy was a wreck. She stayed with me after that, too scared to go back to her own place. We were glued to the news, waiting for any word about Daniel, but there was nothing. It was like he vanished into thin air. Then, one night, she decided to go back to her apartment. She said she needed to face her fear, to prove to herself that he couldn't control her anymore. I tried to talk her out of it, but she was determined. So I went with her, like I always did. When we got there, everything was quiet. Too quiet. She unlocked the door and we stepped inside, holding our breath. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. She walked to the bathroom first, her heart in her throat. The mirror was clean, like nothing had ever been written on it. She let out a breath, finally starting to relax. But then she froze, staring at something behind me. I turned, and there he was, Daniel, standing in the doorway, his eyes wild, his face twisted with rage. "Nancy," he hissed, taking a step forward. "I told you, you can't escape me." Everything after that happened so fast, it's a blur. I remember screaming. I remember Nancy trying to run, but he was faster. I remember the flash of a knife, the sound of it cutting through the air. I remember the blood. So much blood. And then, nothing. The police found her body the next morning. I was in shock, numb, barely able to process what had happened. Daniel was gone, disappeared like he never existed. The case is still open, but they haven't found him. They don't even know if he's still alive. But the messages, they keep coming. Not to me, but to people who knew Nancy, people who loved her. Random, terrifying messages that make no sense, but all with the same theme. You can't escape me. I still see her face in my dreams. I hear her voice, her laughter. And I still wonder if there was something more I could have done to save her. But all I have now are memories, and those chilling messages that remind me every day of just how far obsession can go. A woman named Sarah goes on a trip to a remote cabin with her ex-boyfriend Aaron, seeking closure. They both disappear without a trace, leaving behind an abandoned cabin, Aaron's car, and a lingering mystery that haunts those left behind. Subscribe to our channel for spine-chilling, real-life scary stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't lose anything, but you'll gain thrilling tales and a community of fellow horror enthusiasts. Join us if you dare. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed, hoping that this trip would finally free her from Aaron's lingering presence in her life. It's not like she wanted to go. Who would? But he'd been persistent, almost desperate, and a part of her thought, maybe it would give them both the closure they needed. Maybe if they faced whatever was left between them, they could finally move on. At least, that's what she told herself. Aaron planned everything. He chose a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from any distractions. I remember her telling me about it, how the location was isolated, surrounded by dense forests with no cell service or nearby towns. It sounded like the perfect place to clear your head, but also a bit unsettling. "What if something happens out there?" I asked her. She brushed it off, saying it'd be fine, that they just needed to talk, to have one last conversation without any interruptions. I could tell she was nervous, though. There was something in her eyes that day, something I couldn't quite place. But Sarah was always good at hiding her feelings, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. The day she left, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. I told her to be careful, to call me as soon as she got there, but of course, once she was out of range, there was no way to reach her. That was the last time I saw her, smiling weakly as she waved goodbye. When she didn't check in after a couple of days, I started to worry. I tried to convince myself that she was just taking some time, that maybe they were working things out, or finally getting the closure they needed. But something didn't sit right with me. I knew Aaron. He wasn't a bad guy, but he was intense, obsessive even. Their relationship had been rocky, filled with ups and downs, and I wasn't sure how he'd handle the idea of letting her go for good. A week passed, and there was still no word from Sarah. I couldn't just sit around and do nothing, so I called the police. At first, they didn't seem too concerned. Adults go off the grid all the time, they said. But I pushed, told them about the cabin, how isolated it was, how out of character it was for Sarah not to check in with anyone. Eventually, they agreed to send someone out to take a look. Days later, the police found the cabin, but it was abandoned. They said it looked like no one had been there for days, but everything was left behind. Sarah's bag, her clothes, even her phone, dead and tucked away in a corner. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues as to where they might have gone. But the weirdest part? Aaron's car was still there, parked neatly outside like they'd just stepped out for a hike, but there was no sign of Aaron either. They searched the woods, the surrounding area, but nothing. It was like they just vanished into thin air. The whole thing became this local mystery. People started whispering about the cabin, about what might have happened there. Some said Aaron snapped, that he did something to Sarah and then took off. Others thought they might have run into trouble in the woods, maybe got lost or hurt and couldn't make it back. But me? I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd told me before she left, about how Aaron had been acting strange lately, more clingy than usual, how he kept bringing up the past, trying to rekindle something that just wasn't there anymore. And I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, Sarah knew something wasn't right, but she went anyway, hoping for closure that she never got. The police eventually ruled it a missing persons case, but they didn't have much to go on. Without any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They kept the case open, but as time went on, it faded into the background, just another unsolved mystery. I still think about her sometimes, about what might have happened in those woods, about the conversations they had, the last moments before everything went wrong. I wonder if she tried to run, if she fought back, if she knew she wasn't going to make it out of there. I wonder if Aaron's still out there somewhere, hiding, living with whatever he did. But the worst part is not knowing if she suffered, if she was scared, if she regretted going on that trip, and not knowing if we'll ever find out what really happened to Sarah and Aaron in that cabin in the woods. All I have left are memories of my friend and the eerie, empty silence of a mystery that may never be solved. After years of rebuilding her life, a woman agrees to meet her toxic ex, Chris, who claims to have changed. The meeting quickly turns dangerous as Chris reveals his true intentions, forcing her to escape and reminding her that some people never truly change. Years after escaping a toxic relationship with Chris, I finally felt like I had my life back on track. It wasn't easy. He had a way of making everything feel like it was my fault, twisting things around until I didn't even recognize myself. But I got out, and after a lot of work, I rebuilt my life. I surrounded myself with people who genuinely cared about me, found a job I loved, and slowly started to feel like myself again. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. Then, out of nowhere, Chris reached out to me. It had been years, long enough that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to hear his name and not immediately tense up. His message was polite. He said he'd been going to therapy, that he'd done a lot of soul-searching, and he wanted to apologize for everything that happened between us. He said he'd changed, that he wasn't the same person anymore, and he just wanted a chance to make things right. At first I ignored it. I didn't owe him anything, especially not after the way he treated me. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if maybe it would help me too. Maybe if we talked, I could finally get the closure I never really got when I left. Maybe it would finally close that chapter of my life for good. So, I agreed to meet him. We arranged to meet at a park, somewhere public, neutral ground. I figured it'd be safer that way. We picked a Saturday afternoon, and I remember feeling a little on edge as the day approached, but I kept telling myself it would be fine. Just a conversation, nothing more. When I got to the park, Chris was already there, sitting on a bench near the pond. He looked different, older, a little worn out, but still the same guy I remembered. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I told myself not to read too much into it. We talked for a while, just small talk at first. It was awkward, like we were two strangers trying to make polite conversation. But eventually, he got to the point. He apologized, said all the right things about how he regretted the way he treated me, how he'd been working on himself, how he was ashamed of how he acted. It sounded sincere enough, but there was something about the way he was watching me, like he was gauging my reaction. That put me on edge. He started talking about our relationship, bringing up old memories, both good and bad. He asked if I ever thought about those times, if I ever missed them. I told him no, that I'd moved on, and I was happy with where I was now. His expression changed, just for a second, but it was enough. The warmth in his eyes flickered out, replaced by something colder, something that reminded me of the Chris I left behind. I tried to steer the conversation back to neutral ground, but he wasn't having it. He kept pushing, asking if there was any chance we could try again, if I'd ever thought about giving him another chance. I told him I wasn't interested, that I was in a good place now, and I didn't want to go back to the way things were. That's when things took a turn. He started getting defensive, saying I was being unfair, that I wasn't even giving him a chance to prove he'd changed. He leaned in closer, his voice low, almost threatening, as he reminded me of the good times we had, how much I used to love him. It was like he was trying to manipulate me again, using the same tactics that worked on me years ago. But I wasn't the same person anymore, and I wasn't falling for it. I stood up, told him I needed to go, that this wasn't a good idea. But he grabbed my arm, pulling me back down onto the bench. His grip was tight, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the old Chris, the one who wouldn't let me leave, who needed to control everything. I yanked my arm away, my heart racing, and told him to let me go. His face twisted in anger, and he stood up, blocking my path. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not until we talk this through." Panic set in, but I tried to stay calm. I told him there was nothing left to talk about, that I was done, but he wasn't listening. He kept getting closer, backing me up against the bench until I had nowhere to go. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't going to let me leave. That's when I knew I had to act. I pushed past him, trying to run, but he grabbed me again, harder this time, pulling me back. I struggled, trying to break free, but he was stronger than I remembered. He kept saying things, his voice frantic, desperate, but I wasn't listening. All I could think about was getting away. In a final, desperate struggle, I managed to break free and ran towards the park's exit. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was out of the park and in my car, shaking and out of breath. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't go home right away. I drove around for a while, trying to calm down, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe that after all these years, Chris was still the same person, still trying to control me, to manipulate me. But the other part of me wasn't surprised at all. I never heard from him again after that. I blocked his number, deleted his messages, and made sure he couldn't find me. But the memory of that day still haunts me. I keep thinking about how close I was to falling back into his trap, how easily he could have convinced me to stay if I hadn't seen through his act. It was a reminder that some people never change no matter what they say, a reminder to trust my instincts, to protect myself, and to never let someone like Chris back into my life. I got lucky that day, but I know not everyone does, and that's what scares me the most.